Welcome to the Touching into Presence podcast.
This podcast is for people who are interested in bodywork, empowerment, and somatic-based practices.
I am Nikki Olson.
I'm Andrew Rosenstock.
We are certified Rolfers.
Collectively, we're trained in various movement and bodywork therapies with an emphasis on somatic awareness and client resilience.
Through conversations, our goal is to share and explore mind-body paradigms to offer empowerment possibilities.
It was such a pleasure to be in conversation today with Kevin McCarthy. Kevin is a Somatic Experiencing Practitioner, Advanced Rolfer, and Rolf movement practitioner, specializing in the effects of trauma and chronic pain on the body. Fascinated with the interplay in the body between emotional patterns and physiological adaptations that commonly emerge in the response to traumatic events, Kevin was led to study somatic experiencing after 10 years as a manual and movement therapist. He views the integration of somatic approaches into the wider field of trauma work as a crucial and necessary element in the healing process of those suffering from the effects of trauma. In 2017, Kevin co-founded Men Therapy, a thriving private practice in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with his wife, Carrie Miller, a licensed marriage and family therapist, specifically to address this relationship between somatic and psychotherapeutic approaches to trauma. Men Therapy offers an integrated model of care alongside a commitment to compassion and hope for all those who have been affected by trauma. He regularly consults with and educates health providers, manual therapists, and psychotherapists on the importance and role of somatic intervention in the effective management of trauma. In today's conversation, we spoke about Kevin's experience as a Rolfer and somatic experience practitioner, what we may be doing as Rolfers and or other bodywork modalities outside of normative models of touch and manual manipulations, social media on the bodily experience, working with trauma, enhancing agency in clients, reframing, and just so much more. As you'll hear at points, I get a little bit geeky out as I really enjoy conversations with Kevin. This is not our first. And so I do apologize for any of the bromance and or crushing that happens from my side. I do get a bit excited, as you'll hear. But it was a really great talk. And we really appreciate Kevin and his perspective on this model and way of seeing. Anyways, enough of me blabbering on here. Let's begin the talk.
Hi, guys.
Hey,
Hi.
Kevin.
How you guys doing?
Good.
Doing great. How about yourself?
I'm good. I'm trying to see if there's enough signal out here.
It's better than the last time, I'll tell you that.
That's something, right?
You look great. I got to say, you look great. So it's just since the last time I saw you. I don't know if the beard's different.
I got the beard going on now.
Is that what it is? Yeah, I like it.
That's all.
I like it.
Good. I'm glad.
I'm excited to be in conversation with you because we've had a few conversations before, and I remember getting off the phone with you and being super amped, and getting off the phone with someone I think the day before and being super exhausted, and it was really helpful for me to start to sort of look at my own self-regulation in the process of being in relation with people. So I'm really grateful for you for that. And I think that theme is going to probably come in a bit today.
That's great. Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah. Well, I guess I got certified in 2007 in Boulder for most of the training, and had just come off of working in an ambulance. So I had kind of a ramped up nervous system, and I was learning how to slow down. And Rolfing is very good at that. You spend a lot of time in a small room with people, not talking too much. So that was my practice for 5 or 10 years, as I kind of did basic 10 series work, and then started doing a lot of studying with kind of manual approaches. So I was doing a lot of work with Ron Murray and some stuff with Ray McCall and some Source Point at that point. So I did kind of a gamut of continuing ed, and then 10 years or so in, I always had a struggling practice. I was not able to draw a ton of interest or excitement. Even though I felt like the work was good and the people I did get to work with were good, it wasn't clicking for me as much as I needed it to. And I started getting pretty insecure about that, I think, 10 years in, and started asking people what it's like to be in pain and to want to get better and to be working and paying money to get better and then not always feeling those results. And what happened was people started talking to me about their problem, how it felt to be in pain, where the pain had affected them in their lives, how they remembered being in pain in different ways over the years. And these conversations started stretching out in the beginning of these sessions to 20 minutes and then 30 minutes and then 45 minutes of an hour-long session. And the wild piece was that they would stand up when I decided I had to get them on the table and earn my paycheck, and they'd stand up looking better. Their postures were a little more free. They were a little more upright. They had what looked a little bit like what I was hoping to see when they got off the table before I had ever touched them. And I had no idea what was going on, but I had some sense that it had to do with emotions, and I had some sense that it had to do with how they were relating to their own experience, mostly of pain, but I kind of expanded that definition over time. And then I found somatic experiencing as kind of a process that fit the language I was already thinking in around trauma and chronic pain. And that was a pretty natural dovetail into the work that I had thought I was doing, and finished that in 2017. And then I've been practicing that for the last 5 years. And then in COVID, I had to go. I had been a hybrid Rolfer SE practitioner for 3 years, and then COVID hit and decided to go fully virtual, which I promised I'd never do. And then ended up really liking it. And so now I'm considering transitioning back into a hybrid practice, but I've been full-time telehealth for 3 years now.
Yeah, I really liked in the article coming out in the journal that I read, where you're like, I'm going to misrepresent the words, but you're like, don't tell yourself, don't swear you won't do anything, because
right.
You always swear you wouldn't. And then you found yourself doing that, which is in some way a place I've actually been a lot of, like, in a slightly different way of looking at really non-absolutism and being like, don't say you won't, but also like don't necessarily say you will, because this polarity is not the way that the world works, and that it just ends up coming back and or it can end up coming back. See, even that right there, it does. No, it can come back in. But I mean, similar, the same for me as I was like, when pandemic hit, I was like, oh crap, I'm dead. Like, how am I going to work online? I had my first few sessions, like, they'd been with previous clients, so I already kind of knew them, but I remember being like, whoa, I can actually somewhat feel them across the computer. I mean, feel might not be the right word, but I could sense them. And It was like, whoa, there's actually something here.
Absolutely. No, I mean, we spend a ton of time, both in the training and then in our practices, watching and observing at nuanced levels, right? And that's sorry, it's windy here. That's the whole, one of the whole ways that I think of holism, like one of the ways we see the wholeness of a person. And that doesn't go away when you're online. A lot of what we're doing, and this is something I even talk about in other modalities like somatic experiencing, psychotherapy, like somatic resonance or somatic transference is as real as psychological transference. So we can take on the emotions of our clients in terms of, I feel something when they relate to me in a certain way, but we can also somatically interpret that too. So if somebody's online and they're showing tension or they're showing an emotion, our bodies are going to resonate with that. It doesn't even have to be a magical transference of energy. It's basically just our deep listening skills taking place across a different medium than we're used to when we're in the office in person.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's mirror neurons as well that are going on, and all of that. That's just like, and I'm not sure, but I know that this is a little out of my pay grade, but there's an aspect that as soon as we see something, our brain is processing it, and so we're actually pulling that into our experience on a neurological level as well, which is then going into our body.
Yeah. It's really important for me with clients, especially in a medium where you don't have access to their physical self, to be able to ground what we're seeing and saying really deeply in a felt experience for them, because they're still trying to get their body to feel. And the only way we can change a body is to have it feel differently. You can do that just by talking. You can do that by observing, noticing, and reporting back or mirroring. It's a fundamentally physical process, even though it's not an immediate physical proximity.
I don't know if you had this experience, but as I started to move in a similar way, I had some clients who either I'd already worked with them or they were so set on ideas of touch. And like, I remember I had a few clients who were like in session 3 after seeing me, not that I was doing intensive, like the 3rd or 4th session, they were like, oh, I get what you're doing here now. Like I now, but the first few sessions, they're like, will you shut up? Just touch me, stop talking. And I was trying to be like, no, I'm really working on building awareness of, and unfortunately, there's no way to build awareness without bringing that into awareness of some sort, or no way that I know of. It's been a challenge.
Well, and I think one of the fundamental ways that we shift states of awareness or states of being or shift our clients is by wrapping language around unsubstantial or insubstantial physical sensation, physical experience. If you can't talk about it, it's not really in your cognitive brain. And what we're trying to do is unleash the unconscious into a conscious medium. And you have to wrap language around that for that to work. And part of it is, like you're saying, it's a contract shift in your relationship to the client. You have to prepare them to understand how it's possible for this to work that way. And that's one of the reasons I think the telehealth experience has helped me so much to clarify that contract, because now all of a sudden I don't have to have that go-between of, well, we're a touch-based practice, but we're going to talk a lot, or we're going to do some off-body work or some movement work before we get to the table. Like, that is a confusing paradigm for a client. And there's not a lot of practices or modalities that are really expressing the need for this multi-pronged approach. So we're kind of avant-garde here. We're pushing the medium. And I think that's the part of the why this is so exciting, but it's also part of why we have to be delicate in our transitions. And sometimes we benefit from the transitions that are forced on us, like with COVID.
Well, and also, I mean, this is an awesome conversation because it's something I'm super passionate about, of trying to disrupt the reputation that Rolfing has, is that we're heavy-handed, really pushing painful practice. And I think what's been cool, and I've never really felt that that's kind of the practitioner I am. For sure, definitely nudged the tissue, and like, if the person's lightening up and retracting, then that's obviously too much because they're not in their body. And but also too, it's awesome to have returning clients, and that helps with the overhead. But when I've kind of seen where clients are like, I'm their weekly person, I'm always having that check-in of like, okay, but this work is about stepping away and owning the changes and becoming more embodied and kind of being your own authority. And how do you make changes when you're in discomfort? Like, because I'm a big movement person and love to give homework and really want clients to be empowered, that they don't have to rely on me to get out of pain. And I feel like what's been fortunate of this unfortunate situation with the pandemic and having to figure out how to still do the work, but now through a non-touch, medium, whether through Zoom or at distance, is it really helps clients, or gives support to clients, of finding ways to become better embodied and have more tools. And you spoke to that a little bit in your article that's coming out. And I just wanted to echo that, because I really believe that this work is really about not being dependent on a practitioner and finding ways to become better resourced and have tools.
Yeah, I think actually I'm going to sneak in for a second to say, there's a word you use, Nikki, I think that actually ties it all together, which was like, disrupting the idea of Rolfing, but part of that's also about disrupting patterns, physiological or psychological, in that current process. And that's, I think, where a lot of times talk can become in handy, is a way of almost shining a light on a conscious or unconscious pattern, to even be like, you see, you're always turning right now. You didn't realize you're always turning right. I'm disrupting that for a moment by interjecting that right turn. And now you can still turn right, but you're aware you're turning right. And I really like that word you used, disrupting it. It hit home.
That's exactly what I was keying in on there too. I mean, we use touch in the standard Rolfing process to offer options, right? I think when practitioners, like you're saying, Nikki, have that heavy-handed thing, to me, it's about tolerances. Like, some clients can tolerate that heavy interjection, but it's still a suggestion. I don't believe that we're fundamentally changing tissue with pressure. I think we're changing nervous systems through connection, options, exploration, investigation. Like, we're letting people spend time with their bodies in an intentional, directed way. And that can be done through multiple mediums. That's why there's a million different modalities to do this. What we're trying to do, or open up the practice to, is to use a Rolfing philosophy, which has an understanding of how bodies unfold and what is possible for a body that unfolds to operate in. Like, what kind of experience can a body have that we have a shared understanding of, and that if we can communicate that clearly and directly in whatever medium. I mean, what did Ida say? If you whistle Yankee Doodle and the person, it wasn't Ida, I think it was one of her.
Is Emmett. So supposedly the story is supposedly, it was supposedly Emmett, but I mean, there's so much hearsay at this point.
Sure. But I mean, I like the mythos of that. Like, if you whistle Yankee Doodle and somebody changes, is it Rolfing? And the answer is probably, in my mind, yes. And that's in large part because I think Rolfing has a philosophy that is inherently useful for a practitioner, especially when it's an embodied one, and the practitioner's done the work to embody those principles.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually one of the questions when I was reading your article that I wanted to sort of talk about. I'm clearly biased on it, but I'm open to being biased in a different way. Is like, I'm trying to find the right way to word it. Like, I think that even if we move to doing hands off Rolfing or hands on, hands off, whatever but if you like that, still the initial the education of going in and learning the learning that education, learning hands-on as a way of informing the practitioner of how the body is, in a way. And so there's like, I want to make sure it's heard that we're not saying like, get rid of the old. There's just, and it's actually like, to some extent, it's that old way of, you need technique to forget technique. Right. Mm-hmm. And so my education, although I'm doing something entirely different now, I wouldn't be able to see what I would likely not be able to see what I see had I not been in that process that was then informing me of all this otherness.
Right. Well, and to play with that, I think it's the same as learning craniosacral and integrating it into a Rolfing practice. It's the same as learning movement work and building that into a practice. The fundamental aspect of this is being with a person in an embodied state. So becoming embodied, I think, is best facilitated physically. Absolutely. I think our training reflects that. My recollection of Rolfing school is basically walking around in a circle with people asking me how I'm feeling. Right? I mean, that is at its fundamental level a practice of learning how to be in yourself, how to feel yourself to your edges.
Although there is what I am recognizing is the three of us are Rolfers, so we also have the implicit bias because we've gone through that and may not necessarily know another way. That being said, I agree with you.
Well, and this is the trick. Like, so in somatic experiencing, to bring that in, when I'm in the training there, it is a sit down and listen to lecture training, right? There's practices and modalities, but it's primarily psychotherapists in the room, and there's a smattering of body workers. And what we had to offer, coming from this different viewpoint, is this ability to really parse at a really, I keep saying nuance, but it's like at an incremental level, this person is embodying their breath up to this point. And I know that the clavicle is not moving because I have studied that clavicles have a rotational movement. And I've touched a clavicle when it's moving, and I've touched a clavicle when it can't move. And so having that level of specificity, which you can only gain with time, practice on the body, et cetera, allows me to be that much more nuanced in my observation. And that's what I was able to offer in those classes was, here's a viewpoint when you can actually see that this person is triggered. You can actually see that this person is showing you something different than what they're saying. And if I can use that gulf of the difference between movement and portrayal, then I can offer the clients something that they don't have yet, which is an awareness of their bodily experience in a difficult situation, which is why I think we have something to say as body workers.
Yeah, that's so great. And I'm sorry for bromancing on here, Nikki. I'm just so excited here, obviously. But like, I had this client the other day who was a PhD psychotherapist, right? Like, and it shocked me how, and this is me putting my ideas on, but how the body was not even involved in her own body awareness was not there. And whenever I would ask her, like, what are you aware of? It would be, everything was good. Yeah. And the body was frozen, like in my experience, it would have frozen body. And I'm not judging her, like there's a reason why and all that, but it was so surprising to me that from someone who spent so much time in the field of health, right? That, and there is this, like when I'm hearing you about the SE practitioners, there is this sort of sense of like, it's all about how we're relating to the world. And it's like, but that's, and the mind relates to the world. It's like, yeah, but the body is in relation to the mind and therefore in relation to the world. So why are we not looking at this whole phenomenological beingness, but again, we're biased because that's what brought us in.
We are. But I think we also get to be biased. I mean, I try to stay good at what I'm good at, and I let psychotherapists be great at what they're great at. Like I delight in not having to talk about setting boundaries and family systems and working through relationship issues. Like that is not what I'm good at. I haven't spent 2, 3, 7 years studying those kinds of relationships. What I have done is studying the relationship between breath and movement. And I can talk at length about how that affects relationships and all these kind of psychological aspects, but I'm always coming at it from a physiological standpoint. And that's that juice that we get to have. And so if we're biased, it's great to acknowledge it. I think it's important. But we also need to know that we have something to offer that is different than what's generally available when you're talking about these more psychological realms.
Yeah. And just again, to echo what you just said, that I think is so profound and what we can offer is how emotions are crafted in our body experience and how, and just, I look at a cultural perspective and, what the psychosocial model, I mean, that kind of encompasses it all. But I'm working with a young individual, a young preteen, and who has some spinal deviations, scoliosis. And it's really interesting when I ask questions like, how do you feel? What is it like? And it's like, and it's a lot of like, I don't know, different. I don't know. And so there's a lot of, I don't knows. And then, but coming up with those questions to really kind of find that spark in this being of like, oh, this is different. Like, and I am constantly, I have young kids, they're 5 and 8, but definitely with the pandemic, I did the homeschooling, Zoom school with them, and just seeing how their bodies in that early developmental phase in their life and where the time that the pandemic hit, especially with my oldest, who did actually, I had a preschooler, so he wasn't really in the Zoom world, but like just how much his world became so much more immersed in YouTube, social media, and kind of the social media versus with what is exposing YouTube. I mean, he's navigating the computer way quicker than I ever would want him to, but also seeing how that's shaping his structure and coming like from a Rolfer I'm kind of seeing how his body's kind of slumped over and how he's like in that kind of collapse into the screen, and working with him. And yeah, and just the conversations, like, what do you want to be? I want to be an influencer. And I'm like, well,
yeah. So I think there's something actually really, something I've been working with about that. I'm going to dance around is there's nothing wrong with being an influencer, but what I've sort of noticed is a lot of the people who are doing that, and actually, I think it goes way back for social media. When you look at even Talking Heads, right? Talking Heads, not the band, but Talking Heads, people on TV, it's the head. And that the body is generally not even involved. And what I end up watching with so many of these influencers and these people on, when I watch these interviews, is there's no body, and everything is cut off. Not every, I mean, there's some people who are very, very embodied, but much of it's an act. And so it's a being of how you are perceived to be as opposed to how you are, which to me is the lack of embodiment. And so we're going into this way where people are having to perform all the time on a screen for attention, which is about getting out of our experience into creating another experience, but that's not the purest. And not that it's bad to be an actor by any means, but when it becomes your modus operandi, and you don't know how to go back. I mean, I've talked to actors, I've worked with some actors who part of their character stays with them, which means that there's a disconnect with themselves, with what they're presenting in a way. I may have got off. Yeah.
Well, no, and the degree to which that's unconscious is the degree to which there's opportunity for change. Right? Yeah.
Which I think what was beautiful with what Nikki was saying, when you ask people and they say, I don't know. I actually encourage that a lot for my clients, because I don't know implies an awareness of an unawareness, which is still an awareness, as opposed to good, fine, okay, like I'm done there. But when they're like, I'm not really sure, I'm like, great, be there. We're going to slowly build that out. But the unawareness, the awareness of unawareness is still awareness.
Yeah. Well, and not to hijack the topic, but I recognize at some point in this transition between Rolfing and going to trauma work that I was, I had been deeply unaware of what I now consider the origins of some of these patterns that I was seeing, right? Like there is and this is maybe uncouth to say in the Rolfing circles, but I think there is still a lot of bodies should look like Rolf's bodies, and a Rolf body looks like an upright body. And I absolutely subscribed to that for years and years and years, and tried to emulate that, and felt disembodiment because of that. It wasn't who I was. And when I tried to be that, I was pushing against a gradient, and finally seeing that and recognizing that as, in my mind, trauma. I mean, this is a trauma writ large, not the narrow definition of it, but seeing that it's a part of how a person adapts their body to an environment, to an experience, to an internal experience, and beginning to be able to work with that perception that's shaping posture or shaping reality has, to me, opened up the ability that I now feel to change somebody without having to push against them or use force. I guess that's my bias and writ large, but that's I think a really important piece that we're all struggling to work with in some way.
Yeah. And first, let me just say, it's impossible for you to hijack any conversation, Kevin. You are the guest. You do control the narrative today. So you can.
Well, I like where you guys are going though too. It's a great place. There's a lot of movement around here.
But so I'm going to try to reword what you said in the way that I see it. And I'd love feedback from both of you, which is like a Rolf body or an embodied body is really just about however embodied it can be at this moment. It's not about having a specific structure. It's about how much lack freedom can it have. And the hardest part for me is that resonance that I see in a client is not logical. It's felt. And so it's like, oh, this seems great. It may not match a line like, oh, this should be at 3 inches and this should be straight, but there's a presence of life, even if it's restricted. It's like that's as open as it can likely be today. There's no real formula besides feeling, and that doesn't make any sense because there's no words for it and there's no formula, and yet it is. I mean, so that's kind of how I'm hearing or how I'm echoing it back. And please share.
I think you're right. I mean, that's allowing things to be relative, right? A person can look in a certain way and relatively feel exactly how we would ask them to feel at the end of a session. It doesn't really matter how their body presents. I think the thing that has drawn me into this trauma world more and more and more is the ability to predict experience in the body based on patterns that are visible or that you can witness either in thought or posture or reaction. Because the one thing I think I suffered from in Rolfing a little bit was in looking at somebody, I was creating all these really pretty complex models of understanding. I mean, we have all kinds of internal versus external models and core versus sleeve and all this stuff that has value. And maybe I'm just making a whole nother one. But understanding physiology from a standpoint of trauma, which is really to say, how does the autonomic nervous system affect a person's ability to adapt to the environment they're in? If I can understand how that autonomic nervous system is generally adapting to a given stimulus, like a threat response, I'm able to predict how they're going to work. And by doing that ahead of a client's actual experience, I validate their experience of whatever it is that they're going through. Like if I say, hey, I see that you have a relatively closed posture. You're using all your flexors whenever you're noticing that you're uncomfortable or threatened. Boy, I wonder what it would be like if you found your extensors. What happens if you listen to the sounds behind you as you're sitting here with me? That's a typical Rolf movement thing, but I'm using it from a threat response system that's saying flexors are attached to defensive mechanisms in the body. And this person is looking defensive, even though I know I'm just talking to them in their living room on the internet, right? The ability to predict those patterns of behavior and then engage with them in meaningful ways to actually allow for change has been the medium that allowed me both to, I think, grow my practice exponentially, which is because people were feeling that sense of validation and understanding from a situation or place where they'd never seen that before, or it's just because I feel confident in my ability as both a Rolfer and a trauma worker, to have a sense of I know what I'm doing. And I think all of us get there some way or another, and it doesn't have to be trauma work, but having an internalized sense of I got this and I feel confident in it has been magical for me, I would say.
Well, I think this conversation is just really highlighting the strength that we have, like Rolfing, if we want to call it like the brand name of structural integration. But what we're doing is fostering structural integration. And that's going to look different because bodies, are influenced and shaped differently. I mean, one of the kind of big motivators for me to go into Rolfing was because I was exposed to occupational therapy, and I was like, I'm not doing school all over again. Rolfing kind of seems similar, but my influence was that because I happened to have a brother who became quadriplegic, and he was one of my earliest practice clients. And so, but going through the training and understanding the principles and building that into a body that is, neurologically not going to be, walking in our classic contralateral gait that we're always looking for. But how do I help this individual become better structurally integrated? And through working with him, my brother built my confidence working with that population. So I have worked on a fair amount of people who are paralyzed to some degree, but mostly wheelchair bound, and get to hear like how they're finding a new way of being structurally integrated. And, for some of them, well, I guess everyone that I have worked on was an able-bodied prior. So I've never worked on anybody who was born disabled, quadriplegic or paraplegic. So Yeah, I think what because as we're having this conversation, the little voice is like, okay, but is this really structural integration? I don't know. We're not touching. Can we call this structural integration? Kind of hearing some of the old.
I think that
pioneers.
ties in. I think that ties into, sorry to cut you off, but that's like and maybe you're saying this, but like that's what Kevin I think was getting at with that old story of like of Emmett talking to Ida and saying like, if I saw the periosteum had to release at the hip and I whistled and I went in the corner and whistled Yankee Doodle Dandy, would it be, and it happened, would it be Rolfing? And that she said, yeah, I think it, or she said, what do you think? And he said, I think it would. And she said, yeah, I think it would be too. It's the biggest issue I've sort of struggled with when people say, what is Rolfing? And I give them some sort of a thing, but it's like, it could contain, the way that I understand it, it could contain, it's really just about how do you help someone find freedom in their physiological, psychical, or their psychocorporal experience, which that case could be, I could sit in the corner and blink my eyes 3 times. And if somehow there was a change in my body that resonated a change in their body, sure. But like, that's so effing broad. This is what happens when I come back to Boston. I just swear all the time. It's so broad that like, it doesn't actually tell you anything unless you've been through it. And so then it's like, what is the point? What is the point of words if you can't actually express something? Yet that's as best as you can express it. And I don't know if that's where you're going with Nikki, but I just was called to be rude.
It is. And I yes, totally. And I would love to hear from you, Kevin, with, having a Rolfing background, movement background, somatic experiencing, and also read that you also, which I've taken a dive in studying with the explain pain science. And I would love to hear your take on how do we explain pain? Especially if someone's really feeling it, and because you are kind of in more of this non-touch medium right now, so you're not really like touching on and like working with the pain spot. How do you explain pain to people who are physically feeling pain somewhere in their body, and then having to explain, well, that could actually be in your head without being dismissive?
Right. It's all in your head, but that doesn't mean it's not real. Okay. So the way I this is one of my influences is also Zen Buddhism, right? And one of the things one of my teachers said that has always stuck with me is that pain and suffering are not the same thing. And we add suffering to pain. Suffering, we are able to alleviate. Pain is something we may have to live with. And so I take that as kind of an axiom, in that I am here to help people avoid suffering. I can't always help them avoid pain. And that was always true in my Rolfing practice too. I mean, there were shoulders I could free up, and there are, lesions that can be released. But fundamentally, I'm trying to help people feel agency where pain is taken away. And that lack of agency is, I think, one of the big creators of suffering, or how people experience their pain. So particularly
I've never heard it that way before. And that pain suffering is awesome. So
right.
Sorry.
I know.
Yeah.
I can't claim it. I just love it. It is. It's a fundamentally, it creates agency in the person who understands it. Right. And that goes, I'm trying to track. There was something we were talking about just before the pain conversation started. It'll come back, but, so in the article that's coming out in the journal, I kind of did a mini case study of a client I had who had come in with jaw pain. And this is a person I met online, have never seen them in person. And they did have a 90% or so reduction in pain. I mean, it was a real fundamental change. But part of it was that the majority of it really was that this person was still experiencing the conditions that led up to the pain, the experience they had in they had surgery to try to fix the issue that was all a jaw problem, and their jaw had to be surgically broken and knit back together twice. And that was, the suffering out of that was that this person was terrified of their experience. They were terrified of the second surgery which happened without enough anesthesia, without enough lead time. And these are the kind of things that I think most of our clients, if not all, but most of them have some level of this, where they had the accident, or they had the change, or they had I woke up one morning and my back stopped working. But wrapped around that is this shell of, and then I didn't know what to do. And I had to go to 5 people and they didn't help me. And I am to this day unable to do the things I wish I could do that I used to do that made me feel good. And it's those things that I know I can start to work with. Sometimes that alleviates the actual pain experience that they first came in the door with. But generally what we're trying to do is broaden their experience of their situation to include elements of their condition that they can work with, control, adjust, alleviate. And that's what I think I can really get to.
Would it be too simplistic to say that pain is a physiological occurrence and suffering is the psychological I don't know what's the word, not justification, but like viewing of the occurrence, and so that the
experience
suffering
of the pain,
and so that, or of any and so that the you can reframe the pain and therefore see it as pain, but recognize it as an occurrence, neither having a good or bad, and maybe even sort of learning. I don't want to say learning to deal with it; that might belittle it, but it's when the mind is in its story or in this experience that's when the pain becomes suffering. Otherwise, it's just an occurrence. I don't want to say it's just an occurrence. I'm not belittling pain. Pain is not comfortable, but that it's that suffering is the mental, the psychological, the whatever. That I'm going to say that pain would be the physiological and suffering is the metaphysical.
And I would both agree with that, and I'd also challenge it a little bit in that neurobiologically, and there are people who can speak to this much greater length than I can, but my understanding too is that what we're experiencing as pain is a product of the brain. And a product of the brain is this, we're getting nociceptors activating, which tells the body something's off, right? And then we're either sensitizing the nervous system to that or desensitizing the nervous system to that. And as we actually decrease the experience of suffering, which is what you're talking about, like as we allow a person to have agency and as we make their situation safer and more understandable and we wrap language around it, all those things are having a physical effect in the brain as well. The same nociceptive influence from a part of the body that we're experiencing as pain can be felt as pain one day. And if we can create a new dynamic or a new environment, it can be experienced as just a bothersome itch or nothing the next day, even though the information from the body is the same. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. But I don't ever want to lose the biological importance of changing a psychological situation.
Yeah. I sometimes say to clients, like when I'm working with this, I might say, like, if I hit them on the leg, they'd be like, "Oh, what's wrong?" and really angry. And I'd say, "Oh, but there was a mosquito." And they say, "Oh, it's so good. Thank you."
Exactly. There you go.
It's like that's it. That shift.
That's exactly it. And that can happen for something as crazy as a surgery or something along those lines. Right? The surgery was here to help me. I'm really glad I got this surgery. I would not be able to be who I am today without the surgery, even though the surgery hurt me so much. You know, that's a very different experience.
And going back to, how our experiences are influenced by our surroundings. I mean, not to, again, be dismissive of someone who truly felt traumatized. So I mentioned I have kids. Being in the holistic wellness, I of course was like, "Oh, I'm going to try to go drug-free and blah, 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 blah." I had very medical deliveries, and I had a C-section, and I thought it was so fascinating. Not that I really want to go through surgery like that again, but I was like, okay, this is how it's going down, and I'm going to be open to it. And then of course, I meet a lot of other moms who feel like their body failed them, or just the fact that they had a C-section, that was like hugely traumatic. And I'm like, well, why? Like, what is your true story? Forget about what the rest, and especially being, I think, in Boulder, where, there's a lot of like, pat on the back if you did it, drug-free and at home in a tub. So, and those are probably very beautiful experiences too. But I'm often nudging the languaging around, in this particular case with deliveries, like just because it was a surgery and different doesn't necessarily make it a traumatic experience. But I think so I challenged the narrative a little bit of like, no, make it your own. Like, don't forget about what the rest of the world has said about how you should have been delivering a baby. What is your personal experience, and was that truly traumatic? And it's been fun just with some parents or moms who deliver that way. Really, we're grateful to have that conversation, because they're like, yeah, wait, what? I was subscribing to a narrative that wasn't really mine. And when I look back at it, it was a great experience.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I mean, it's like you said, challenge the narrative. The voice of the masses is seen as the best, but it's really like, no, that's just what's popular. And I was having this talk with someone the other day. I was like, Galileo was not popular. He was crazy. He's completely crazy, but yet we subscribe to him now. At that point, he was. And so there's this like similar when I have clients and they sort of go on stuff. I'm working on a better way to say this, but I sort of say the only time your body has ever failed you is when you're dead. And more or less, and I know it's not the best way to say it, I'm working on it, but more or less, whatever your body is doing, it's doing as best as it knows how. And so you're really, it's not that it's failed you, it's that it's doing what it knows, or however best it can. And so really change that narrative of this is bad, this is good, to this is. And so how can I relate more to isness and have a improvement towards how I see improvement, or a disimprovement to how I don't see improvement?
I had a therapist once who said she loved working with people who had deep trauma, lots of trauma, because she said, all of them have made it this far. I trust their bodies to keep them going because they had to make it this far to even get to see me. And I absolutely subscribe to that. I think one of the things we have in our toolbox as body workers is time and context. And especially with something like the 10 series, where we also are asking a person to return, and then to return to the same territory and just expand that territory a little bit each time, but also revisit all the different systems that are present in any one session in the next session, and building on that. We can take that into these larger contexts too, where it's like, okay, so yeah, we're talking about surgery, and we're talking about how if you are looking at it from a certain viewpoint, it's positive. If it's not positive, why? Right. And one of the big things that has helped me open up my Rolfing practice into this larger context is if I can really ask the why questions, even though those are a little bit, they can take me out of my scope of practice. They can take me out of necessarily where I think I can do meaningful work. At least I'm offering this person an opportunity to reflect on their own experience. If I have somebody who's gotten a C-section and it's deeply traumatizing versus somebody who's been able to have one and experiences as positive, that's telling me a lot about that person and as a whole. If that person who doesn't experience it as beneficial, what is it in their system that is scared? Why are they scared? Why are they still hurting years after the fact? If I can get to the nugget there and start to support them in an experience of their system as, like you said, Andrew, always having done the best they could. It's just that those compensations aren't supporting their system's health now. But if we understand and have compassion for the fact that this person has been through their own unique experience and can relate to that from this wholly contextual fabric that we weave together in our sessions, I think we have a way of touching into things that most people don't get a chance to feel, don't have a lot of experience with in healthcare type situations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're contextual beings and we need to be treated as such. Bodywork offers a way to do that without a lot of caveats that other systems have, where there's more boundaries and less broad ability to engage.
Yeah, and I want to highlight something that I've heard a few times, and I want to enrich it, which bodywork can, Rolfing can, but through what lens? And when you're a hammer, everything's a nail, and I think we're all like trauma informed people. So I think it's really to if we have to add the label of like trauma informed or polyvagal informed or somatically informed, whatever, that it's because a lot of Rolfing isn't helpful. In fact, it can be, I shouldn't say a lot. Some Rolfing, I'm working on my verbiage a lot. Some Rolfing is actually detrimental, which is partly why some of the reputation is there. And so when the Rolfers start to get, or the body workers or whatever, start to become more informed of the experiential beingness of a human and how, I think I talked to you this before, Kevin. I think I mentioned this in the podcast. I tried to stop using the word trauma because I saw it as a loaded word that people were like, they were like identifying as trauma survivors as a badge. Not that that's wrong, but there was, and there's coping mechanisms. And I was trying to take that away from them to help them grow so that the badge wasn't weighing them down. And I just would say trauma is just, essentially the shortness. It was a process that an experience of life that was never processed. And so looking at this life experience that hasn't fully been digested, hasn't fully been processed, but using that lens as opposed to just fucking plowing through and like, I'm going to like push tissue and you're going to have a cathartic experience and that's helpful. And it's like, no. And I believe the three of us, when we talk about body work and we talk about Rolfing, we're talking about, informed of this. Yet I want to just put that little caveat on there because some people listening may not be aware of that. And I think it's really important to add that suffix onto it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important to also though acknowledge that at least, and this is maybe deeper than it needs to go, but at least at the Rolf Institute, my understanding is that it's a progressive approach to incorporating elements that we discover as important into the body of work that we call Rolfing. So that's why we have paradigms, right? An energetic paradigm, a manual paradigm, and a movement paradigm. I think one of the things we do need to point out is that, and I agree again with your definition of trauma, like there's a dearth of language. There's a lack of enough appropriate language. I use trauma in a broad sense. I call it lower T trauma, like everybody has. And I say basically everybody has some level of it. And I say that because in my experience, trauma is simply an inability of the system to manage whatever it's experiencing in real time at the time it happens, right? It's a processing error, just like you said. In that sense, everybody has it. And in that sense, if we're not attending to it on a table or on video or whatever, we are missing a significant element of our client's experience. And we are plowing through tissue when in fact, we're actually plowing through protective patterns. One of the reasons our clients get off the table looking better than they did when they got on it, and then when we see them walk into their car, it's all back, is the fact that we were taking away a pattern that their body sees as absolutely necessary. And that to me is a crime. I mean, I use strong language because I feel very strongly about this, but we are missing the fact that most of our clients are resisting some of our work, not because we're doing it wrong or because they're unable to take it, but because we're trying to take away something that at that point is important for them. It is not essential that they keep that thing. Our job is to like change that. But how we change that needs to have the awareness of the system that we're working on. And that system is a traumatized system, regardless of what their story is. We need to have the tools in our toolkit to acknowledge that and then work with it skillfully. It doesn't mean we're psychotherapists, and it doesn't mean we're outside of our scope of practice. It's an essential component of our work. And I think it needs to be validated as such. Thank you. That's my soapbox.
Well, and I think it's very true. I mean, I think that's part of our structural integration education. And I said this in an earlier podcast, and it's shaped a lot of how I look at patterns. But in my early training, we were told often what limits us is what serves us, and really recognizing those patterns. And I think, however, I mean, we're all living beings. I mean, we're going to be subjected to trauma to some degree, whether it's a, capital T, little t. And we can find resolution around it, but it's not to say that we're not ever going to get triggered and have a moment of something that will remind us or, bring that back on. I think what the job that we have is to not live with it in the moment that we get triggered, that we're able to like shake it off, just like what we, Peter Levine talks about in his work of like with the animal, the deer that was about to get hit by the car, didn't get hit. What did they do with that that reactive energy, shake it off. So us humans have, different ways of doing it. We could be an actual virtual, like really, like literally a shake, or whatever tools that feel right for them. And I think that's part of being a structural integrated being, because we're integrating all the different variables of life. And how do we have those variables and still operate in some kind of structural integrity without, collapsing into it?
Right. And I think this is too, when I talk about being a body worker who doesn't work on bodies, I mean it literally, right? Like, I'm working with your physiology. If you're sitting in front of me and you're having a trauma response, my job is to help you moderate that trauma response in a way that is both health-oriented, effective, intuitive, and functional, right? And in order to do that, I have to have enough understanding of how that system works at a physiological level to be able to engage with it in a meaningful way. I was not taught that in Rolfing school, right? I'm glad to hear that at least something in your experience pointed you to that. My experience was that when a person had a cathartic moment or was overwhelmed, the practitioner was told to either slow down or pause or cover the client with a blanket or give them some time. And while that's doing no harm, right? And I appreciate that, it's not an active engagement with that person's nervous system. And as a structural integrator, I think that I'm working on helping a nervous system adapt. And that's why the body changes.
Yeah.
If I can do that, yeah, go ahead.
And just to say, like, I mean, I'm with you 100%. And just because I think you and I both like to expand awareness or come off sort of devil's advocate. It's not that. It's just to say, I don't know if the Rolf Institute or other bodywork experiences, institutes, schools can offer that, because they already have a great program at however many hours, and it's a lot to ask of people. And there's a part of me that always kind of, not always, but started to feel like they should have a continuing education class, maybe that's also like required for advanced training, where you dive more into that. I think part of the issue is that most of the Rolfers I know are completely dysregulated, but that's a side story. But I don't want to like poo-poo on the school because of what they're limited to as well. And at the same point, like, yeah, I'm so lucky that I found other parts of which I think the Rolf movement training can really incorporate a lot of this. Right. I am lucky. I think I shared this before. I had in one of my Rolf movement trainings 2 years after my basic training, one of the ladies that was in my class, she's like, I feel like you matured 25 years in 2 years. And it was because I was so unregulated. I mean, I still am, but I was so much more unregulated, and that wasn't being dealt with at all. And I got fortunate that I found a good therapist, and I found good body work ways that were heavily, and I found Dr. Porges, but I'm with you. I just don't want to like shit on the Institute more than it already gets because of their limitations as well.
I agree. I guess part of what I'm saying is I think, no, you're absolutely right. I do think we're poor at incorporating these paradigms that are outside of the manual. I will say that with confidence, because the energetic taxonomy has had an uphill battle for I don't know how long. I'm not necessarily practicing in that, but I recognize its existence, and I recognize that it took a lot of extra personal effort to get there. That said, I think that is on the practitioner. You get to choose the curriculums that you choose. And you're right, the training is a basic fundamentals training. It is not an advanced training in and of itself. That said, I do love the fact that movement has an ability to speak to this. Nikki, we both talked about Monica being one of the practitioners who taught us a lot. I was in Brazil as well, learning my movement from her, and her movement sessions looked like the work I'm doing today as a trauma oriented practitioner. Her ability to parse what movement was showing of the emotional experience of the person, to engage with that movement, the movement, not the emotion, but the movement, to allow for a different set of outcomes, which then allowed the person, the client, to experience their own reality differently in a course of an hour was just remarkable. And the way she could talk about it and knit together these frameworks into a conceivable whole was just like what I think is possible in our educational system. There does need to be some level of narrowing our scope of what we're actually trying to teach. But I wanted to see, when I was on a table shaking, or a client in a practice session at the trauma at the Rolf Institute was experiencing overwhelm, I want to see the word trauma being included in there. So at least it's something people know to look for and then seek out further training. I guess that's, I can be okay with that as major beef.
Yeah. And I recognize I was one of the fewer people who got to take advantage of the unique training of getting my dual certification. So having the role for the structural integrated component weaved in real time with Rolf movement, I know I got a different education. Also, Lael King being a somatic experience practitioner. So that was really in the classroom for us and for someone. And, I went out, had a practice for many years, and then later came back and was part of the phase 1 teaching team for about 6 years. So, and then, assisted some phase 2 teachers. I'm pretty aware of what's being taught recently. And again, different teachers have a little different influence or slant. So some classes get more peppered with the languaging around how to actually talk about trauma and someone who's actually having an experience of trauma, or whether the client's actually really feeling it, but you're seeing it in the body. There's it's
great
difference, but for sure.
Glad to hear
and,
that.
To recognize too, Rolfing, again, being in Boulder where there's like tons of Rolfers and it's still pretty amazing, all the different opinions or thoughts of what it is, what it actually isn't. But I have a friend two different friends who their experience is knowing it about being super, emotional. And they're like, I'm just not in the mood to get on the table and start crying. And I'm like, it doesn't have to be painful. And they're like, no, I'm just not ready to do that experience. And
right.
Where there's other people who are like, yeah, it's super painful. I'll never want to do that.
Well, and I think that's a really good point too, though. I mean, like we have to be, I get on the soapbox about, let's talk about trauma and let's do that. And absolutely, some people don't want to do that and they don't have to. I absolutely should allow for that possibility and that eventuality. Like the idea to me of resourcing. So this is a somatic experience thing, but you resource a client before you ask them to do something hard, right? You get somebody on a table and you give them a good experience. They don't have to cry every time. They get on the table and they feel like, this is my body alive with energy. This is my body experiencing the room as a positive, beneficial thing. We need that in our systems. We need that more than we need deep, dark shadow work. We need to feel connected to life. And so however somebody does that and whatever they get out of their Rolfing experience, whether it's trauma, energetic, manual, movement, as long as they're connecting with that sense of aliveness, I do think that we're touching on exactly what we need to. I guess it's just my hope that there is then an ability to acknowledge the things that may also be supportive of that person's change or transition.
I mean, how I hear it, when you say we're sort of touching on what we need to, I think you could say that we're touching into presence.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think we're asking for presence to show up in the body. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was just more making a joke because that's the name of our show, in case you want to.
Oh, is it really? Well, thank you. Sorry. I thought it was the Andrew and Nikki hour, so I'm happy to hear.
I mean, today it's really like, yeah. I mean, no, it was partly a joke, but partly also like, I've said this before, I didn't really fully plan on this name. And as it sort of came to be, it has numerous ways it could be said, but part of it is just what you said about like, what are we doing? But we're touching into the presence of life and of another human being in relation to it. And when I What I noticed, there are certain times, there are certain calls that I never want to end. I'm like, let's just stay on this three-way forever. And there is time, and we all have work and life and stuff. I'm going to echo back to what I said at the beginning of the call, which is like, I already know, and it's not just the coffee, but I already know when I get off the phone, I'm going to be beaming. I'm already like, my body is so alive, so excited from this call, from being in conversation with both of you, for going over what I believe to be true and reinforcing that, from hearing other ways of seeing, and just from really, I think, from being in a relationship with two other nervous systems that are working themselves out, that are present, that are excited, but that are not like hitting highs and lows, but really in this beautiful state of presence. And so I know when we're done, I'm going to get off and my wife and I are going to do something, and I'm going to have a shit-eating grin, because I'm feeling resourced. I'm feeling really nourished by this conversation.
Likewise.
Same. Yes, I think these conversations are always so fun, and especially looking at the greater scope of who we've had as guests, and coming from the Dr. Ida Rolf Institute, formerly known as the Rolf Institute, the Guild, and KMI, all of this. And it is coming back to how do we find structural integration, and that's what I think what's beautiful about our work is different practitioners can pepper it, style it in a way that matches who their strengths are. And I think to some degree, people might think, oh, structural integration is all over the place, but I don't really think it is. It's that our founder, Dr. Ida Rolf, really crafted this later in her life. And in some ways it was left incomplete. And we get to, as generations beyond her, in her honor, get to acknowledge that, because she has said it is in her publications, that the structural integration isn't just the body, that there is the movement component, the psychology component, but those all weren't really fully developed because she was like in her 80s, I think.
But also, what is movement but a body? You need a body to have movement. What is psychology but the processing for the body? Like, this is why I think it's like Rolfing is all over the place. It's like, yeah, you could see it that way, or you could take a step back and sort of see this thing of like, oh, how, this is where eco-psychology, I think, drives into. We sort of say, how are relations of things together? There was another thing I was really excited about, I was going to say, but I forgot what it was. So I'll stop.
I think we are all messy, and I think that's part of our benefit. I think humans adapt to whatever they experience, and that is what we're seeing and working with in our clients. We're helping them to adapt in ways that they choose rather than in ways that they unconsciously experience. And I think we do that in the medium that we feel best able to work in. I found my medium in trauma. Other people find their mediums in manual therapy. I don't think there's a wrong answer. I'm grateful to be part of a community that can have a dialogue that includes all of this messiness and still comes like with the sense that we can do something to support and heal others. I think this is a calling, and whatever that happens to be, it's great to do so in community. And I'm just grateful that you guys are here to help this conversation continue.
And I think that's where what I forgot that I remembered, which is sort of like we said, oh, well, the Rolf Institute doesn't have this. It's like, no, they don't. But like, without tooting our own horn, like, part of these talks are for that. So people going into body work, whether it's Rolfing or other, have an access to say, great, you've got this. And there's this arm over here. So come listen to Kevin talk about this experience. And then you can think about that. You don't have to incorporate it, but you can think about that for your experience. And that's a real gift of this. We're a small talk show, but when we get that feedback of like, I'm really loving what you're doing, I really learned that, it is it's worth it.
Absolutely.
Well, in the name of this great, beautiful mess of life and how we process, I wanted to just close with saying that it was super fun to meet you virtually and to have this conversation, and look forward to the article that's going to come out.
Yeah. Well, and it's just a pleasure to be here with you both. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Kevin, and have a great day out there.
Thanks for listening to us at Touching Into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Kevin at mendmn.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast and subscribe to it through the platform of your choice. When you do this, it really helps other people find us, and we greatly appreciate your support. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching Into Presence. Bye for now.